I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was Christmas Eve, and the only thing stirring in the brownstone that should have been stirring was the scent of paprika and the distant hum of Fritz's festive preparations. Instead, at 9:15, the doorbell rang. Not the polite, tentative chime of a deliverer, but a series of insistent jabs that threatened to crack the mahogany. Wolfe, who was cultivating orchids and therefore not cultivating interruptions, merely grunted from the plant rooms. I, however, was in the office, meticulously polishing the already gleaming surface of my desk, a task I undertake with religious fervor roughly once every 2 months. I considered ignoring it. A man's got to have some principles, especially on a holiday. But the bell persisted, a sonic assault on our domestic tranquility. "Goodwin," Wolfe called, his voice carrying with an unnatural clarity that meant he wasn't merely grunting but issuing an order. "Attend to that infernal racket." I sighed, pushed back my chair and straightened my tie. "Merry Christmas, boss," I muttered under my breath, though I knew better than to wish him anything so saccharine. He detested enforced cheer. I opened the door to find not a carol singer nor a lost soul seeking warmth, but a woman. She was wrapped in what looked like $1,000 worth of mink, which, considering the unseasonably mild December night, seemed more like a statement than a necessity. Her face was pale, almost translucent, framed by a severe blonde bob that looked like it had been carved rather than cut. Her eyes, a startling blue, were wide with an emotion I couldn't quite place, fear certainly, but also a kind of brittle desperation. "Mr. Wolfe?" she asked, her voice a low, throaty whisper that suggested she was either on the verge of tears or had just swallowed a considerable amount of gravel. "Mr. Goodwin," I corrected, leaning against the door frame with what I hoped was an air of casual indifference. "Mr. Wolfe is occupied." It was a flexible term, occupied, covering everything from orchid care to his afternoon nap. "I must see him," she insisted, her gaze darting past me as if expecting Wolfe himself to materialize in the foyer. "It's urgent. It's about a theft." "A theft? On Christmas Eve?" My eyebrows did a silent assent. Wolfe wasn't exactly known for chasing down stolen baubles, unless those baubles had a direct pipeline to his stomach or his bank account. "What was stolen?" I asked, already half convinced. This was a waste of perfectly good pre-Christmas dinner air. My recipe," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My family's secret recipe for nacreous nougat. It was taken from my safe this afternoon." I blinked. Nacreous nougat. It sounded like something you'd find in a medieval alchemist's pantry, not a modern-day theft case. I could already hear Wolfe's dismissive snort. This was either the most ludicrous case to ever darken our doorstep, or it was a prelude to something considerably more devious. With Wolfe, you never knew. The man had a peculiar knack for sniffing out grand larceny in the most unlikely of places. Still, a recipe? I led her into the office, noting the way she clutched her mink coat, as if it were a shield against the world. She took a seat on the red leather chair opposite Wolfe's desk, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Wolfe, alerted by my presence and perhaps the faint scent of expensive perfume, emerged from the plant rooms, his massive form filling the doorway. He paused, his eyes the color of stagnant pond water, fixing on our guest. He didn't speak, didn't offer a greeting. He merely stood there, a formidable, silent question mark. "This is, Mrs. Naomi Roth," I supplied, feeling a sudden need to fill the weighty silence. "She claims her family's secret nougat recipe has been stolen." Wolfe's eyelids lowered infinitesimally. He moved to his desk, settling into his custom-made chair with a barely perceptible sigh that conveyed the depth of his displeasure at being disturbed. He picked up a paper knife and began to toy with it, his gaze never leaving Mrs. Roth. "Nougat," he rumbled, the word a low growl. "You wish me to recover a confectionery formula?" Mrs. Roth flinched, but quickly composed herself. "It's more than that, Mr. Wolfe. This recipe, it's been in my family for generations. It's our legacy. It's worth millions. We were planning to launch a new luxury brand next year." This could ruin everything. Her voice gained a fragile strength. And I suspect my own brother. My interest, which had been flagging, now perked up considerably. Family feud, stolen heritage, and millions at stake. Now we were getting somewhere. Wolfe, however, remained impassive, his expression unreadable. He merely continued to eye Mrs. Roth, as if weighing her sincerity against the inconvenience of the request. "Why me, madam?" Wolfe finally asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Surely the police are equipped to handle such a matter, even on a holiday." "The police? They wouldn't understand," she said, wringing her hands. "They'd treat it like a petty squabble. This is an intellectual crime, a betrayal, and I was told you are the only one who appreciates such things, the only one who can truly unravel a tangle without making a greater mess." Wolfe steepled his fingers, his eyes drifting to the ceiling. A flicker, almost imperceptible, of something akin to amusement, or perhaps a challenge accepted, crossed his features. He didn't say yes, didn't say no. He merely returned his gaze to Mrs. Roth, a silent assessment hanging in the air. I knew the signs. He was hooked. Not by the nougat, certainly, but by the subtle insinuation that this was a crime worthy of his considerable intellect, a puzzle that required more than mere legwork. And perhaps, just perhaps, the disruption to his Christmas Eve, however minor, had piqued his irritation enough to demand satisfaction. "Very well, Mrs. Roth," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the room. "You may commence, but be succinct. I abhor garrulity before dinner." I suppressed a grin. Christmas Eve, a stolen nougat recipe, and a family poised on the brink of confectionery warfare. This was going to be anything but quiet. And just like that, the brownstone's carefully cultivated tranquility was officially disturbed. Wolfe had a way of leaning back in his chair that suggested he was settling in for a long winter's nap. But the way his eyes remained focused on Naomi Roth told a different story. He wasn't sleeping, he was calculating the cost of his interrupted evening against the potential satisfaction of making a fool out of a thief. Mrs. Roth, for her part, looked like she was sitting on a crate of dynamite. She had shed the mink, revealing a charcoal silk dress that whispered of old money and new anxieties. The succinct explanation Wolfe demanded took some doing. According to Mrs. Roth, the nacreous nougat was the cornerstone of the Roth family fortune, or what was left of it. Her grandfather had invented the process, a delicate manipulation of temperature and aerated honey that resulted in a texture supposedly impossible to replicate without the precise measurements. The original manuscript, handwritten and stained with the spills of 60 years ago, had been kept in a wall safe in her library. "The safe was not forced," she said, her voice regaining that brittle edge. "The combination is known only to 4 people besides myself. My brother Julian, my cousin Arthur, my head of production, Marcus Thorne, and my personal secretary Elaine Vance. We were all at the house today for a small pre-holiday gathering. I went to check the document before dinner. I had intended to bring it to my lawyer on Monday, and the velvet box was empty." Wolfe's fingers danced a silent rhythm on the arm of his chair. A velvet box, decorative but hardly secure. "And why, may I ask? Did you feel the need to move it to a lawyer now, after decades of domestic storage?" "Because Julian is a fool," she snapped. "He's been lobbying to sell the formula to a conglomerate, Continental Confections. They've offered a sum that would tempt a saint, but they'd mass-produce it. Strip away the soul of the product. I refused. Last night we had a row that could be heard in the next county. Today the recipe is gone." Wolfe grunted. "Conflict provides motive, Mrs. Roth, but it does not provide proof." "Archie." I didn't need the prompt. I already had my notebook out. Got it. A disgruntled brother, a cousin who probably wants a cut, a production chief who knows the value, and a secretary who knows where the bodies are buried. It's a standard lineup, boss, but it's got a holiday flavor. "It is an intolerable intrusion," Wolfe remarked, though whether he meant the theft or the fact that Mrs. Roth was currently dripping teardrops onto his Persian rug was up for debate. "However, the sanctity of a proprietary secret is a matter of some gravity. Archie, you will accompany Mrs. Roth back to her residence. I require the presence of these 4 individuals here, in this office, at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Tomorrow is Christmas, Nero, I reminded him. I usually call him Mr. Wolfe when we have company, but the absurdity of summoning a group of suspects on Christmas morning required a bit of personal leverage. Fritz is planning a goose that requires a degree of silence usually reserved for a monastery. Wolfe's jaw set. The goose will be served at 11 o'clock, Archie. If they value their reputations more than their morning cocoa, they will attend. Mrs. Roth, you will inform them that I am investigating a matter of corporate discrepancy at your request. Do not mention the police. If the thief believes they are merely facing a private inquiry, they may remain bold enough to be caught. I escorted Mrs. Roth to the door, promising to meet her at her East Side townhouse in 20 minutes. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was staring at the wall map of the world as if he could see the stolen nougat recipe floating somewhere over the Atlantic. You realize, I said, leaning against the doorframe, that Julian and the rest of the gang aren't going to be thrilled about spending their Christmas morning in a brownstone on 35th Street. We're going to have a very grumpy office. Let them be grumpy, Wolfe muttered. They have disturbed my peace. It is only fitting I reciprocate. And Archie, before you depart, tell Fritz we shall require a light supper. The intrusion of Mrs. Roth has depleted my energy. Right, light supper. I'll tell him to hold the nougat. I headed for the cool night air. The city was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that only happens when most of the population is tucked away behind locked doors with too much eggnog. The Roth townhouse was a 4-story limestone monster that looked like it had been designed to keep people out rather than welcome them in. A butler, who looked like he'd been pickled in vinegar, admitted me, and within 10 minutes I was standing in a library that smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. The suspects were already there, and the tension in the room was thick enough to spread on a cracker. Julian Roth was a tall, thin man with a mustache that looked like it belonged to a silent film villain. He was currently pacing the length of the rug, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. Arthur, the cousin, was shorter, rounder, and looked significantly more nervous, fidgeting with his cufflinks. Marcus Thorne, the production man, sat in a corner with his arms crossed, his face a mask of professional irritation. Elaine Vance, the secretary, was the only one who looked composed, sitting near the fireplace with a book she wasn't actually reading. "This is ridiculous, Naomi," Julian was saying as I entered. "A private detective? On Christmas Eve? If you've misplaced the paper, just say so. There's no need for this theatrical display." "I haven't misplaced it, Julian," Naomi said firmly, though I could see her hand trembling as she reached for a chair. "Mr. Goodwin is here to ensure that we all meet with Mr. Nero Wolfe tomorrow morning. He has a few questions regarding the safe." Thorne rose, his voice booming. "I have a factory to oversee, or I would if we weren't on holiday. I don't have time for Wolfe's eccentricities." "You'll have time," I said, stepping into the light and giving them my best "I know more than I'm saying" smile. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer the NYPD to handle the invitations." Inspector Cramer isn't known for his holiday spirit, and he's much less comfortable than Mr. Wolfe's office. Mentioning Cramer usually does the trick. It's like mentioning a shark to a group of people treading water. They all went quiet, a collective shiver of apprehension passing through the room. I spent the next hour doing what I do best, watching. I watched Julian avoid his sister's eyes. I watched how Elaine Vance kept glancing at the safe behind the painting of a very dour-looking ancestor. I watched the sweat bead on Arthur's upper lip. By the time I left to head back to the brownstone, I had a pocket full of impressions and a very bad feeling about the next 24 hours. Wolfe wanted a mystery of strategy, and he'd certainly gotten one. The air in the Roth house didn't just smell like Christmas pine, it smelled like old secrets beginning to rot. When I let myself back into our foyer, the house was dark save for a single light in the kitchen. Fritz was sitting at the table, a glass of wine in front of him. "Mr. Wolfe is in bed?" I asked. "He went up 10 minutes ago, Archie. He said to tell you that if the brother wears silk socks, he is almost certainly the thief." I laughed and headed for the stairs. "Tell him I'll check his hosiery in the morning, Fritz. Merry Christmas." As I closed my bedroom door, I looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, a piece of paper worth millions was hidden, and 4 people were wondering how much Nero Wolfe actually knew. Personally, I was wondering the same thing. Usually, when Wolfe gets that look in his eye, it means he's already 3 moves ahead of everyone else, including me. I fell asleep to the mental image of a velvet box, empty and accusing, sitting in a dark library. It wasn't exactly a sugar plum, but in our business it was the closest thing we ever got. The morning of December 25th dawned with the kind of crisp, heartless clarity that usually makes people feel like they ought to be out doing something wholesome with a sled. Inside the brownstone, however, the atmosphere was less jingle bells and more War of the Roses. Wolfe had spent his scheduled hours from 9 to 11 in the plant rooms, presumably discussing the ethics of grand larceny with the Phalaenopsis. I'd spent my morning doing the tactical prep, checking the yellow chairs, ensuring the beer supply was sufficient to survive a siege, and making sure the air in the office didn't smell too much, like the fried kidneys Fritz had served for breakfast. Promptly at 11, the doorbell began its second movement. It wasn't the frantic jabbing of the previous night, but a series of distinct, character-revealing rings. The first was a long, arrogant buzz that had Julian Roth written all over it. I admitted him, and he blew past me into the foyer as if he were checking into a hotel where the service was beneath him. He was indeed wearing silk socks, midnight blue to match a suit that cost more than my car, and he looked like he hadn't slept a wink, which I took as a personal victory. Close on his heels were Arthur, the cousin, and Marcus Thorne, the production chief. Arthur looked like he was trying to disappear into the collar of his overcoat, while Thorne seemed ready to punch a hole through the nearest wall. Last came Elaine Vance, the secretary. She was wearing a sensible tweed suit and an expression of grim competence that reminded me of a headmistress about to hand out detentions. I ushered them into the office. Wolfe was already in his chair, a mountain of black silk and immovable intent. He didn't rise, he rarely did for anything short of a national emergency or the arrival of a rare bulb. He merely inclined his head about 1/8 of an inch, which for him was practically a standing ovation. "Please," Wolfe said, his voice a deep, vibrating cello note that commanded the room. "Be seated. Mr. Goodwin has arranged the chairs. I trust you all find them adequate." Julian Roth didn't sit. He marched to the edge of Wolfe's desk and planted his hands on the mahogany. "Let's get one thing straight, Wolfe. My sister is hysterical. This theft is a family matter that should have stayed behind closed doors. We are here under protest, and only because Naomi threatened to call the district attorney." Wolfe looked at Julian's hands as if they were a pair of particularly uninteresting beetles. "Your protest is noted, Mr. Roth. It is also irrelevant. A document of immense value has vanished from a locked safe. That is not a family matter, it is a felony. Whether it remains a private one depends entirely on the cooperation I receive in the next hour." "You have no authority," Thorne growled from the red leather chair. He was a thick-set man with hands that looked like they were more at home with a wrench than a nougat tray. "I've got 1,000 employees and a production schedule that doesn't stop for Christmas. I'm here because I don't want my name dragged through the mud." "Then keep your name clean by speaking the truth," Wolfe snapped. He shifted his gaze to Arthur, who was perched on the edge of his seat, twitching. "Mr. Farrell, you are the cousin. You have a minority interest in the Roth confectionery empire, do you not?" Arthur jumped as if Wolfe had poked him with a cattle prod. "Yes, I have 5%, but I don't get involved in management. I'm a silent partner. Mostly. Silent yet present at the house when the safe was opened," Wolfe observed. "And Miss Vance, you've been family for 12 years. You know the combination to the safe. You also know, I suspect, the exact market value of that recipe should it be offered to a competitor." Elaine Vance met Wolfe's gaze without blinking. "I know many things, Mr. Wolfe. I know the company is currently over-leveraged. I know that Julian wants to sell, and Naomi wants to martyrize herself for a tradition that is slowly bleeding us dry. But I don't steal. It's inefficient." I sat at my desk, my notebook open, enjoying the show. It was a classic Wolfe opening, prodding the cage to see which animal roared first. The suspects were a perfect cross-section of motive. Julian had the greed, Arthur had the desperation of a man living beyond his 5% means, Thorne had the technical know-how to make the recipe disappear into a rival's lab, and Vance had the brains to orchestrate the whole thing. "The situation is this," Wolfe said, leaning back and steepling his fingers. "The safe was opened with a combination. There was no physical trauma to the locking mechanism. This suggests that the person who took the recipe did so with a degree of confidence and leisure. They did not expect to be caught immediately. However, the thief was also rushed. They left behind a very specific residue." I looked at Wolfe. He hadn't told me about any residue. This was either a masterstroke of psychological baiting or he'd found something in the plant rooms that I'd missed. "Residue?" Julian laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "What is this, a detective novel?" "It was a library, Wolfe. There's dust, there's ink, there's tobacco." "And there is something else," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Something that does not belong in a library, but is intimately connected to the Roth legacy. Something that was disturbed when the velvet box was removed." He let the silence hang in the room, heavy and suffocating. I watched the four of them. Julian's bravado seemed to leak out of him like air from a punctured tire. Arthur turned a shade of grey that matched his suit. Thorne looked confused, and Vance just watched Wolfe with a clinical curiosity as if he were a specimen under a microscope. "I will not name it yet," Wolfe continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I prefer to give the guilty party a chance to reflect. We are currently in a state of grace. The law has not been summoned. Police are busy with more seasonal tragedies. But that grace is finite. Archie, give our guests some refreshment. It is, after all, Christmas." I stood up, knowing the refreshment was just a way to keep them trapped in the room while the pressure cooked. As I moved toward the kitchen to get the tray Fritz had prepared, I caught a glimpse of Wolfe's face. He looked satisfied. He hadn't solved it yet, not quite, but he'd set the board. The unholy quartet was now under his roof, and in the brownstone, Wolfe was the only one who knew the rules of the game. Wolfe's idea of refreshment was a tray of Fritz's cider and some spiced nuts, which I served with the kind of forced cheer that makes people want to kick you. Once the suspects were sufficiently hydrated and marinating in their own suspicion, Wolfe gave me the look. It was a slight shift of the jaw that meant I was to leave the heavy thinking to the mountain in the chair and go get my shoes dirty. I slipped out of the office, leaving the unholy quartet to stare at each other, and headed back to the east side. The Roth townhouse resembled a daylight mausoleum. The pickled butler, whose name turned out to be Hames, let me in with a look that suggested he'd prefer to be basting a turkey. I told him I needed another look at the library, and since Naomi Roth had given me the run of the place, he couldn't do much but sniff and lead the way. The library was one of those rooms that felt like it was designed for people who didn't actually read but wanted you to know they could afford to. Floor-to-ceiling oak, a rolling ladder, and enough leather-bound sets to start a university. The safe was hidden behind a portrait of a man who looked like he'd just bitten into a very sour lemon, presumably the grandfather who'd invented the nacreous nougat. I swung the portrait aside. The safe door was ajar, just as Naomi had left it after discovering the loss. I didn't care about the combination. I cared about what Wolfe had called the residue. Now, Wolfe is many things, but a liar isn't usually one of them, at least not to me. If he said there was something there, he'd see it in his mind's eye before I'd even noticed it with my own two. I got on my hands and knees with a magnifying glass. I felt like a fool, but being a fool is part of the job description when you work for Nero Wolfe. I checked the carpet, baseboards, and interior of the safe. Nothing but a few stray fibers from the mink coat and some standard-issue New York dust. Then I looked at the velvet box itself. It was sitting on a side table, a deep crimson thing that looked like it had once held a crown. I peered inside, empty. I ran a finger along the satin lining, then I saw it. In the very corner of the box, wedged into the seam, was a tiny, translucent flake. It was smaller than a fingernail, almost invisible against the red. I teased it out with a pair of tweezers from my kit. It wasn't paper, and it wasn't dust. It looked like a shard of dried sugar, or maybe a piece of very thin glass. I dropped it into a glassine envelope. Next I did the rounds. I needed to know where everyone had been during the pre-holiday gathering. I started with Hames in the pantry. Mr. Julian was in and out of the library all afternoon, Hames said, polishing a silver spoon with grim intensity. He claimed he was looking for a book on estate law. Mr. Farrell, the cousin, spent most of his time by the bar. He seemed agitated. "And Thorne?" I asked. Mr. Thorne stayed in the parlour with Miss Vance. They were discussing production quotas, or perhaps they were arguing. It's hard to tell with Mr. Thorne. His normal speaking voice is a shout. "Did anyone leave the house?" "Only Miss Vance briefly. She said she'd forgotten a file in her car. She was gone for no more than 5 minutes. I thanked him and moved upstairs. I wanted to look at the guest rooms. It's amazing what people leave behind when they think help is not sought. Julian's room was a mess of silk ties and expensive luggage. I poked through his briefcase, nothing but contracts from Continental Confections. He was definitely planning a sellout. Arthur's room was different. It smelled of cheap cologne and desperation. In his wastebasket, I found a crumpled telegram from a bookie in New Jersey. Arthur owed 20 grand, and the tone of the message suggested that Merry Christmas wasn't the sentiment the sender had in mind. That gave Arthur a very loud motive. I went back to the library. I stood where the thief must have stood. If they had the combination, they didn't need to hurry, but Naomi had said she'd check the safe just before dinner. That meant the window was small, maybe 30 minutes. I looked at my grandfather's painting. One of the eyes was slightly chipped. I leaned in. It wasn't a chip. It was a hole, a pinhole camera. No, too old-fashioned. A peephole. I stepped behind the wall into the small service corridor that ran behind the library. Sure enough, there was a small viewing port disguised by the texture of the oil painting. Someone had been watching that safe. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. This wasn't just a family squabble, it was a stakeout. I headed back to the brownstone, the glassine envelope burning a hole in my pocket. The city was starting to wake up now, families heading to church or to grandmothers' houses. The smell of wood smoke in the air. When I let myself back into the office, the quartet was gone. Wolfe was alone, nursing a glass of beer and staring at a sprig of holly I'd stuck in the pencil jar. "They've been dismissed?" I asked, hanging my hat. "For now," Wolfe said, his voice heavy with thought. "I have planted the seeds of doubt. Now we must wait for them to germinate. Did you find it?" I pulled out the envelope and laid it on his desk. I found something, a flake of something clear, and I found a peephole behind the grandfather's portrait. Someone was watching the safe, boss, and Arthur Farrell is in hock to the tune of 20,000. Wolfe took the envelope, holding it to the light. He didn't look at the betting slip I'd mentioned. He was mesmerized by the flake. 20,000 is a pittance, Wolfe murmured. "This, Archie, this is the key. It is not sugar, and it is not glass." "Then what is it?" Wolfe looked at me, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It is evidence of a very specific kind of vanity. Tell me, Archie, did you notice the secretary's hands?" "I noticed they were steady. Why?" "Precision," Wolfe said, tapping the envelope. "Precision is the hallmark of the specialist. We are not looking for a thief who wants money, Archie. We are looking for a thief who wants perfection. Now call Saul Panzer. I have a mission for him that requires a very delicate touch." I reached for the phone, wondering how a tiny flake of nothing could lead us to a thief. But that's the thing about Wolfe. He doesn't need the whole cake. He just needs the one ingredient that doesn't belong. Wolfe's mood had shifted from the usual holiday lethargy to a focused, dangerous stillness. When Saul Panzer arrived, there were no pleasantries about the season. Wolfe gave him a list of names and a specific address in the Diamond District, along with instructions whispered so low I couldn't catch them over the sound of the wind rattling the office windows. Saul nodded, his weathered face showing nothing but professional curiosity, and disappeared back into the grey afternoon. I expected Wolfe to return to his books, or perhaps demand an early sampling of Fritz's chestnut stuffing, but he remained behind his desk, his eyes fixed on the glassine envelope I'd brought from the Roth house. The little translucent flake sat there mocking the both of us. "Archie," he said suddenly, the word cutting through the silence like a blade. "Go to the plant rooms. Check the third bench in the tropical room, the Cymbidium erythrostylum." I frowned. Usually my duties in the plant rooms are limited to staying out of the way of the sprayers. "What am I looking for, a festive spider?" "Just look," Wolfe snapped. I took the elevator up. The air in the plant rooms was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth and the heavy sweet scent of thousands of orchids. It was a world away from the cold, suspicious reality of the Roth theft. I found the Cymbidium, a delicate, white-petaled beauty with a bold red lip. It was one of Wolfe's favorites, a specimen he had nurtured from a seedling with more tenderness than he'd ever shown a human being. I looked, and then I looked closer. One of the primary blooms, a perfect star of ivory, was missing a petal. It wasn't a clean break, as if it had fallen naturally. It had been nipped off, a jagged edge of green stem showing where the surgical precision of a fingernail, or a small pair of scissors, had done the deed. I felt a cold prickle of alarm. The brownstone was a fortress. Between the locks, the bolts, and my own presence, nobody got in or out without being accounted for. Yet, someone had invaded Wolfe's private sanctuary, the only place on earth where he felt truly at peace, and mutilated his prize. I went back to the office. Wolfe was standing now, which was never a good sign. He was staring at the door as if he could see through the wood. "Well," he asked. "The white orchid," I said. "It's been trimmed. Someone took a souvenir." Wolfe's face didn't redden, it became pale, a sure sign that his temper had moved past the boiling point and into the zone where things start to melt. "A trespass," he whispered. "An intolerable, calculated trespass. They sat in my office, Archie. They breathed my air. They drank my cider. And while you were occupied with their coats or their questions, one of them found a way to strike at me. It's not just an orchid, boss," I said, leaning against my desk. "It's a message. They're telling you that your house isn't as safe as you think it is. But how? I was with them the whole time they were here. Except when you went to the kitchen for the refreshments," Wolfe finished for me. 2 minutes, perhaps 3. Long enough for a motivated person to slip out of this room, ascend to the roof and return. "On Christmas?" I whistled. "That's some high-speed horticulture. But why? Why take a petal when you've already stolen a multi-million-dollar recipe?" "Because the recipe was about greed," Wolfe said, his voice regaining its resonance. "The orchid is about ego. The thief is not satisfied with wealth, Archie. They want to prove they are superior to the great Nero Wolfe. They want to show me that they can move through my world with the same invisibility with which they moved through the Roth library." He sat back, the chair groaning under his weight. He picked up the glassine envelope with the translucent flake and held it next to a small magnifying lens. "This flake, Archie, I told you it was not sugar. It is a dried polymer, a specific type of liquid glass used in the restoration of fine porcelain and in the preservation of botanical samples. It is a hobbyist's tool, used by those who wish to keep the ephemeral from fading." The pieces started to click, but they weren't quite forming a picture yet. "So we're looking for someone who likes to keep things, a collector, someone who couldn't stand the thought of the nacreous nougat being sold and debased by a conglomerate, someone who wanted to preserve it, like a bug in amber." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "And our thief made a mistake. In their arrogance, they couldn't resist taking a piece of my excellence to add to their collection. They didn't just steal a recipe, they stole a moment of my life. They have turned this into a personal duel." He looked at the clock. It was nearly 4. The short winter day was dying, casting long blue shadows across the office rug. "Call them back," Wolfe ordered. "All of them? Now? It's dark out and Fritz is about to start the goose. Now, Archie. Tell them the matter of the residue has been resolved. Tell them I have found the thief's signature, and if they wish to avoid a midnight visit from the police, they will be here by 8 o'clock. And Archie, bring my automatic from the drawer. If someone is bold enough to prune my orchids, they may be desperate enough to prune the messenger." I did as I was told. As I dialed the numbers, I watched Wolfe. He wasn't looking at the map or the books anymore. He was looking at the empty space on his desk where he expected the truth to appear. The brownstone's festive spirit had evaporated, replaced by a cold, intellectual fury. Someone had stepped into Wolfe's garden, and before the night was over, he was going to make sure they regretted every single step. The wind had picked up, rattling the heavy drapes of the office and carrying the sharp, metallic scent of a New York snowstorm in the making. Inside, the atmosphere was colder. Wolfe hadn't moved from his desk for 3 hours, a silent Buddha of retribution. He had ignored 2 calls from orchid enthusiasts and a query from Fritz regarding the proper temperature for the Burgundy. He was waiting for Saul Panzer, and more importantly, he was waiting for the clock to strike 8. Saul slipped into the room at 7:15. He didn't look like a man who had spent his Christmas chasing ghosts through the Diamond District. He looked like a weary clerk who had just finished a long shift at a hardware store. He handed Wolfe a small, manila envelope and took the seat I offered him. Saul is the only man Wolfe truly trusts with fieldwork, mostly because Saul sees the things other people are too busy looking at themselves to notice. "You were right about the polymer, Mr. Wolfe," Saul said, his voice low and raspy. "It's a specialized grade, sold only through 3 suppliers in the tri-state area. I spent the afternoon at the shop on 47th Street. The owner wasn't thrilled about opening up on a holiday, but $50 of your money made him remarkably festive." Wolfe opened the envelope, spilling its contents onto his desk. It was a ledger of recent sales. "And a purchase was made 2 weeks ago," Saul continued. "A pint of the stuff along with several fine-tipped brushes and a set of archival-grade specimen jars. The buyer didn't use a name, paid in cash, but the owner remembered the car. A black town car with a specific dent on the rear fender. I tracked the plate. It belongs to the Roth estate, but it's the one primarily used by the staff and the production office." I leaned in. "Thorne or the secretary?" Saul shrugged. "The driver says he dropped the car at a garage for a tune-up that afternoon. He didn't see who took it, but someone did, and there's more." I poked around the Continental Confections headquarters. They have a security guard who likes to talk when he's bored. He mentioned a visitor who's been meeting with their VP of Acquisitions 3 times in the last month. Not Julian Roth, a woman, short, blonde, very quiet. "Elaine Vance," I muttered. "The efficient secretary. She's been playing both ends against the middle." Wolfe didn't look convinced. He tapped the ledger with a thick forefinger. "Efficiency is a motive, Archie, but it is rarely a passion. The person who mutilated my orchid acted out of passion, a warped, possessive desire to own the unattainable. Would Miss Vance risk her position for a petal?" "Maybe she's a secret gardener," I suggested. "No," Wolfe rumbled. "She is a secret architect. She builds structures of logic. This theft is too emotional, too messy in its psychological footprint. Saul, did you find the other item?" Saul reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound diary. "Found it in the glove box of that town car. It's got names, dates, and a list of imperfections. It looks like a catalogue of failures." Wolfe opened the diary, his eyes scanning the pages with lightning speed. As he read, his lips tightened. "Vandalism," he whispered. "Intellectual vandalism. Archie, our guests will be arriving shortly. I want the office prepared. Move the chairs into a semicircle. Place the red chair in the center, directly under the light, and bring the box I asked you to fetch from the cellar." The box from the cellar was a heavy, iron-bound chest that Wolfe used to store curiosities from past cases, items he couldn't bring himself to destroy but didn't want to look at. I set it on the small table near his desk. By 8 o'clock, the bell was ringing again. The suspects returned, looking even more ragged than they had in the morning. The holiday spirit had been thoroughly squeezed out of them. Julian was snarling about his lawyers. Arthur looked like he was about to faint. Thorne was vibrating with suppressed rage, and Elaine Vance remained as cool and impenetrable as a block of ice. "Sit," Wolfe commanded, not looking up from the diary. They sat. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. I stood by the door, the weight of the automatic in my shoulder holster a comforting presence. Wolfe let the silence stretch for a full 2 minutes, a classic tactic to let their own guilt do the heavy lifting. "The recipe for nacreous nougat," Wolfe began, his voice surprisingly gentle. is a remarkable document. It represents the intersection of chemistry and art. To some, it is merely a source of wealth. To others, a burden of tradition. But to one of you, it is a masterpiece that must be protected from the vulgarity of the marketplace. He looked at Julian. Mr. Roth, you wish to sell it. To you it was a commodity. You are too shallow to be our thief. He turned to Arthur. Mr. Farrell, you are a gambler. You needed the money. But you lack the patience for a long-term heist. You would have snatched the paper and run, not left a residue behind. He looked at Thorne. Mr. Thorne, you are a man of machines. You value the process, not the product. You find the recipe's complexity an annoyance, not a treasure. Finally his gaze settled on Elaine Vance. She didn't flinch. And you, Miss Vance, you are the keeper of records. You see the world in terms of order and preservation. You met Continental Confections, yes, but not to sell the recipe. You met with them to ensure that if the sale went through, you would be the one in charge of the archival process. You wanted to be the museum's curator. You have no proof of any of this, Vance said, her voice like a thin wire. I have the polymer, Wolfe said, pointing to the glassine envelope, and I have the orchid. He opened the iron-bound chest and pulled out a small glass jar. Inside, suspended in a clear liquid, was the white petal from the plant rooms. The thief didn't just take it, Wolfe whispered. They preserved it. They wanted to keep a piece of my excellence for their own private collection, but in doing so, they left traces of their obsession. Archie, lock the door. The time for strategy is over. The time for exposure has begun. The tension in the room snapped like a dry twig. Julian stood up. Thorne growled, and Elaine Vance's mask finally began to crack. Behind them, I turned the key in the lock. The brownstone was no longer a sanctuary, it was a courtroom, and Nero Wolfe was wearing the robes. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the only punctuation Wolfe needed. He didn't look at the door. He kept his eyes on the semicircle of faces, each one illuminated by the harsh glow of the desk lamp, like a row of gargoyles. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his beer, the foam clinging to his upper lip for a second before he dabbed it away with a linen handkerchief. The gesture was maddeningly calm, a calculated insult to the frantic energy vibrating from the four people trapped in the room. We find ourselves in a curious position, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that register of resonant authority that usually meant someone was about to be dismantled. A recipe has been stolen, an orchid has been defaced, a family is on the brink of fiscal and moral dissolution, and yet the person responsible for this chaos is currently sitting among us, convinced that their intellectual superiority remains intact. They believe that because they move with the silence of a shadow, they cannot be touched by the light. Julian Roth slammed his fist onto the arm of his chair. Enough with the riddles, Wolfe. You've locked us in here like common criminals. If you have something to say, say it. If not, I'm calling my attorney and we're leaving, locked door or not. Wolfe didn't even blink. Mr. Roth, your attorney is currently at a dinner party in Westchester, and your ability to leave this room is entirely dependent on my satisfaction. Do sit down. You are making the air unnecessarily turbulent. To my surprise, Julian sat. There was something about the sheer mass of Wolfe, combined with the utter certainty in his tone that acted like a physical weight on the room. Let us examine the strategy of the thief, Wolfe continued, his eyes now roving slowly from Thorne to Vance. The theft of the nacreous nougat was not a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of philosophy. The thief knew the family was fractured. They knew Julian wanted to sell and Naomi wanted to hide. By removing the recipe, the thief forced a crisis. They didn't just want the paper, they wanted to control the outcome of the Roth legacy. They wanted to be the one to decide whether the formula lived or died. Marcus Thorne shifted uncomfortably, his heavy boots scuffing the rug. You're talking about ego, Wolfe. I'm a production man. I deal in tonnages and temperatures. I don't give a damn about philosophical heists. I just want my factory back to normal. "Do you?" Wolfe asked, a sharp edge entering his voice. "Or do you find the prospect of a Continental Confections takeover threatening? After all, a conglomerate brings its own engineers. They don't need a man who knows the old ways of aerating honey. They want efficiency. Perhaps you thought that by misplacing the recipe you could make yourself indispensable as the only man who has the process memorized?" Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry purple. "That's a lie. I've given 20 years to that company." 20 years of service, or 20 years of resentment, Wolfe countered. He turned his attention to Arthur Farrell. "And you, Mr. Farrell, your gambling debts are not merely a secret, they are a death sentence for your social standing. If the recipe were sold, your 5% would disappear into your creditors' pockets. But if the recipe were lost, and you happened to find it for a price, well, that's a different game entirely, isn't it?" Arthur looked like he was trying to swallow his tongue. I wouldn't know how to open that safe if my life depended on it. Except you were seen in the library 3 times yesterday. I piped up from my station by the door, looking for books. That's a lot of reading for a man who usually spends his time studying the racing forms at Aqueduct. Wolfe nodded his approval of my interjection. "You see the pattern, Archie? Everyone has a reason to move the pieces on the board, but only one of them has the precision to do so without leaving a footprint. Only one of them would think to use a liquid polymer to seal a stolen document against the humidity of a hiding place. And only one of them would be so enamored with their own cleverness that they would dare to take a trophy from my own plant rooms." He leaned forward, the desk lamp throwing long predatory shadows behind him. The person who took the orchid petal did so because they recognized in me a fellow master of detail. They wanted to see if I was as observant as the legends suggest. They wanted a shadow play with a man who lives by logic. It was a fatal mistake of vanity. Elaine Vance, who had remained remarkably still, finally spoke. Her voice was cold, precise, and entirely devoid of the panic that was consuming the men. "You are spinning a narrative out of thin air, Mr. Wolfe. A polymer flake, a missing petal, a few disgruntled motives. Any lawyer would laugh this out of a courtroom. You have no physical evidence connecting any of us to the actual theft of the recipe." Wolfe's eyes snapped to hers. "Evidence is ashore, Miss Vance. I am interested in the flow. The tide is currently rising, and it is carrying the scent of a very specific betrayal. You mentioned earlier that you met with Continental Confections to ensure your role as curator. But what if your role was more active? What if you realized that the only way to save the Roth legacy from Julian's greed was to steal it yourself and hold it in trust?" He paused, letting the implication hang. "Or perhaps what if you weren't the one who stole it at all? What if you merely watched it happen and used the knowledge to your advantage?" The room went cold. For the first time the suspects began to look at each other with genuine naked suspicion. The unholy quartet was no longer a group. They were 4 individuals looking for a way to climb over each other to reach the exit. Wolfe had positioned them perfectly. He had planted the seeds of doubt, and now he was watching them blossom into a garden of mutual destruction. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "bring the records of the internal phone lines from the Roth house, the ones Saul retrieved from the basement exchange. I didn't have any phone records. Saul hadn't found any, but as I reached into my pocket for a stack of blank stationery, I saw the flicker of movement I'd been waiting for. Someone's composure didn't just crack, it shattered. The office had become a pressurized chamber, the kind where the slightest movement might cause a structural collapse. I pulled a stack of papers from my pocket, nothing but blank invoices and a list of orchid supplies, and held them with the kind of reverence one usually reserves for a signed confession. Wolfe didn't even look at the papers. He didn't have to. He was watching his eyes. A man can lie with his mouth and his hands, but when he thinks his private whispers have been captured on a wire, his eyes turn into a roadmap of his panic. "These records," Wolfe said, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum, detail a series of calls made from the library extension between the hours of 3 and 5 yesterday. One call in particular was placed to a private residence in Queens, a residence belonging to a former employee of the Roth family, a chemist who was dismissed by Julian 3 years ago for redundancy. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It felt like the air had been replaced with lead. Julian Roth's face went from an arrogant sneer to a mask of blanched confusion. Arthur Farrell was sweating so profusely I thought he might slide right out of his chair. But it was Marcus Thorne whose knuckles had turned white as he gripped the arms of the red leather chair. "The internal exchange is a marvelous thing," Wolfe continued, leaning back so that his face was half lost in the shadows above the lamp's glow. "It records the origin and the destination, even if the conversation remains private. The thief didn't just want the recipe for themselves. They knew they lacked the facilities to utilize it. They needed an ally, someone with the technical proficiency to verify the formula and eventually to help recreate it under a new banner. A banner that would rise from the ashes of the Roth Empire once Julian had successfully bankrupted it." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Thorne. "You, Mr. Thorne, have spent 20 years in the shadow of a family that treats you like a piece of industrial machinery. You watched Julian plan to sell your life's work to a conglomerate that would discard you within a month. You were desperate, but desperation alone doesn't grant one the finesse required to open a safe without a scratch and leave behind a microscopic trace of archival polymer." Thorne opened his mouth to speak, but Wolfe held up a massive hand, silencing him instantly. "Wait. We must consider the mechanism of the theft. The safe was opened, the velvet box was removed, a single flake of polymer was left behind, a substance used by those who value preservation above all else. This brings us back to the curator. Miss Vance, you are a woman of immense discipline. You saw the theft happen. You saw it because you were the one watching through the peephole in the service corridor. You weren't watching to prevent the crime. You were watching to ensure you had leverage over the criminal." Elaine Vance leaned forward, her eyes like 2 chips of blue flint. "A fascinating theory, Mr. Wolfe, but watching a crime is not the same as committing one. If I saw someone take the recipe, why wouldn't I simply tell Naomi? Because you wanted the same thing the thief wanted," Wolfe snapped, his voice suddenly sharp as a whip. "You wanted control. If the thief had the recipe, and you had the proof of their guilt, you would be the true master of the Roth fortune. You could dictate terms to Julian, Naomi, and the thief himself. You allowed the crime to proceed because a stolen recipe is far more valuable as a blackmail tool than a kept one is as a corporate asset." Wolfe turned his head slightly, his eyes fixing on the one person who had remained almost entirely silent throughout the evening. "But there is a flaw in that logic. Whoever took orchid petals, it was not a leverage move, it was not a corporate strategy move, it was a move of pure, unadulterated vanity. It was the act of a person who believes they are a ghost, a person who has spent their entire life being overlooked, being treated as a secondary character in their own story, and who finally decided to step onto the stage and take a bow." He picked up the glassine envelope containing the translucent flake. "This polymer is used to restore fine porcelain. I asked Saul to check the hobby shops. He found the purchase, but he also found something else. He found that the buyer had asked for a specific type of solvent, one used to clean antique lace." Wolfe's eyes moved to Arthur Farrell. Arthur looked like he was about to have a stroke. "Mr. Farrell, you are a gambler, you are a loser, you are a man who owes money to people who do refuse apologies. You didn't take the recipe to save the company or preserve a legacy. You took it because you were the only one pathetic enough to believe you could get away with it if you simply copied the movements of someone more competent." I didn't," Arthur squeaked. "I don't know anything about lace." "No," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you know about the safe. You saw the combination written in the back of your cousin's ledger months ago. You expected Christmas party chaos. You slipped into the library, But you weren't alone. Someone was watching you. Someone who had already prepared the way. Wolfe looked at the quartet. Tension was at its absolute zenith. The thief is not the person who held the paper. The thief is the person who orchestrated the vacuum into which the paper fell. Archie, the door. I didn't move from the door, but I shifted my weight, the holster creaking. "Ready, boss?" "Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, "you may stop pretending to be a victim of circumstance. Your phone calls to the dismissed chemist were not about redundancy. They were about the price of a stolen secret. And Miss Vance? Your silence was not an act of observation, it was an act of partnership. You both made the mistake of relying on a man as unstable as Mr. Farrell to do the dirty work. And Mr. Farrell made the mistake of trying to impress me." Wolfe stood up, his massive frame dominating the room. "The recipe is not in this room, but the person who knows its exact location is currently clutching a handkerchief that smells of the very solvent I mentioned. Arthur, hand it over." Arthur Farrell's hand flew to his pocket, then froze. The room erupted. Julian lunged for Arthur. Thorne stood up with a roar, and Elaine Vance simply closed her eyes. In the middle of the storm, Wolfe stood immovable, the master of the house and the master of the game. The office didn't explode into violence, mostly because I had moved from the door to the space between Julian Roth and his trembling cousin before Julian could land a punch. Wolfe remained standing, a mountain of granite in a black tailored suit, looking down at Arthur Farrell with a mixture of pity and profound boredom. Arthur was crumpled in the red leather chair, his face a ghostly shade of grey, his hands shaking so violently that the linen handkerchief he'd tried to hide fluttered to the rug like a wounded bird. "Pick it up, Archie," Wolfe commanded. I used a pair of tweezers from my desk to snag the fabric. Even from a foot away, the sharp medicinal tang of the solvent, the liquid glass cleaner Saul had tracked, was unmistakable. I held it out for the room to see. It was the white flag of a defeated man. "You see, Mr. Roth," Wolfe said, his voice regaining its calm, rhythmic resonance, "the tragedy of the amateur is always vanity. Arthur did not steal the recipe for the money alone. If he had, he would have delivered it to his creditors weeks ago. He stole it because he wanted to be the one who finally held the power in this family. He wanted to be the man who decided the Roth legacy's fate. He used the polymer to seal the envelope, believing it would preserve the ink for a century, a trick he learned from a restorative arts class he took 3 years ago to impress a woman. And he took my orchid petal for the same reason, to prove that he could best the man his sister so desperately relied upon." Arthur let out a sob that sounded like a wet cough. "It wasn't just me. Thorne told me the company was dead. He said Julian was going to sell us out for pennies. He told me if I got the paper, he had a chemist who would pay us double what Continental was offering." Marcus Thorne didn't deny it. He sat back, his arms crossed, a sneer of cold contempt on his face. "The company is a corpse, Arthur. I was just trying to salvage the organs before Julian buried it. I didn't think you'd be stupid enough to go poking around Wolfe's greenhouse." "And Miss Vance?" I asked, looking at the secretary. "Where does she fit in the puzzle? Miss Vance is the only one in this room with a true sense of irony," Wolfe remarked, settling back into his chair with a groan of protest from the springs. "She didn't help Arthur, and she didn't conspire with Mr. Thorne. She merely observed. She found Arthur in the library yesterday, witnessed his clumsy theft, and instead of reporting him, she chose to wait. She wanted to see how the pieces would fall. Had I failed, she would have approached Arthur tonight and taken the recipe for herself. She is not a thief of action, Archie. She is a thief of opportunity." Elaine Vance inclined her head slightly, a gesture that was almost an admission of respect. "A fair assessment, Mr. Wolfe. In a world of fools, one must occasionally play the scavenger. Where is it, Arthur?" Wolfe's voice was no longer patient. It was a low, dangerous rumble that demanded an end to the theatre. "The recipe. You didn't leave it in the house, and you didn't bring it here. You wouldn't risk carrying it past me. Where is the nacreous nougat?" Arthur looked up, tears blurring his vision. I put it in the mail. I addressed it to myself at a post office box in Grand Central. I was going to pick it up on Thursday once the heat died down. I thought if it was in the system, no one could find it. Wolfe sighed, a sound of immense exhaustion. The United States Postal Service as a co-conspirator. How very pedestrian. Archie, call Saul, he's still near the station. Have him secure the box. I will provide authorization from Mrs. Roth. The room seemed to deflate. The high-stakes tension of a multi-million-dollar theft had ended not with a shootout or a chase, but with a confession over a soiled handkerchief and a trip to a post office box. Julian Roth looked at his cousin with a loathing so deep it bordered on the physical. Naomi Roth, who had been standing by the window in a state of shock, finally moved. She walked over to Arthur and, without a word, took the handkerchief from my tweezers and threw it into the cold fireplace. "You've destroyed us, Arthur," she said, her voice a hollow whisper, "not because you took the paper, but because you made us all look at what we've become." "I shall require my fee, Mrs. Roth," Wolfe interjected, his voice cutting through the family drama with the precision of a scalpel. "And I shall require a formal apology for the desecration of my cymbidium. Recovering the recipe is a matter for your lawyers now. I have exposed the truth. I have no interest in the subsequent litigation. Archie, show them out. The air in this room has become stagnant." I escorted the group to the door. Julian and Thorne left without a word, two predators who had lost their scent. Naomi led out Arthur, looking like a man heading to the gallows. Elaine Vance paused at the threshold, looking back at Wolfe. "You're a very expensive man, Mr. Wolfe," she said quietly. "Intelligence usually is, Miss Vance," Wolfe replied, already reaching for the book he'd been forced to set aside hours ago. I closed the door and returned to the office. The clock was ticking toward midnight. The Christmas Eve enigma was solved, the sanctuary of the brownstone was restored, and somewhere in the kitchen I could hear Fritz finally beginning the final preparations for a very late, very necessary dinner. The heavy thud of the front door echoing through the hallway was the most melodic sound I'd heard all day. It signaled the end of the Roth family's holiday pageant and the beginning of a silence that was long overdue. I walked back into the office, stretching my arms until my shoulders popped. The room still held the faint, lingering scent of expensive mink and cheap desperation. The predators had finally cleared, leaving only the housemaster behind his desk. Wolfe hadn't moved. He was staring at the empty glassine envelope on his blotter, his expression unreadable. To anyone else he looked like a statue of Buddha carved from 300 pounds of prime beef. But I knew better. He was mentally reshelving the case, filing away the quirks of the suspects and the chemical properties of archival polymer into the vast, dusty archives of his mind. "Well," I said, leaning against the doorframe, "that's one way to spend Christmas. I hope the fee is going to cover the damage to your blood pressure, not to mention the orchid." Wolfe let out a long, slow breath. "The fee will be adequate, Archie. Mrs. Roth is a woman who understands that the price of one's reputation is always higher than the cost of a private investigator. As for the orchid, the damage is more than physical. It is an affront to the order of things. To think that a creature as intellectually flaccid as Arthur Farrell believed he could use my hobby as a footnote to his incompetence. He was trying to play in your league, boss. That's a dangerous game for a man who gets confused by a post office box." I moved toward the desk and picked up the magnifying glass, turning it over in my hand. "You knew it was him the minute I mentioned the solvent, didn't you?" "I knew it was him the moment you described the way he sat in that chair this morning," Wolfe rumbled. "The others were driven by greed or professional preservation. Vulgar motives, but logical ones. Arthur was driven by a need to be perceived. He is a man who has spent 50 years being the cousin, the minority holder, the gambler. He didn't just want the recipe, he wanted the spotlight. When a man like that enters a room with someone of my stature, he cannot help but try to leave a mark. The petal was his signature. It was his way of saying, I was here and I am significant, and now he's significant enough to be looking at a grand larceny charge, I noted. Though I bet Naomi drops the hammer, she'll want to keep it in the family, even if the family is currently a pile of smoking rubble. The kitchen door opened, and the scent of roasting goose, rich, savory and heavy with herbs, drifted into the office like a peace offering. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his chef's whites pristine, though his face carried the weary satisfaction of a man who had won a long war against a stubborn oven. "Dinner is served, Mr. Wolfe." "Archie," Fritz said, bowing slightly, "the chestnut puree is peaking. I have taken the liberty of opening the 45 Montrachet." Wolfe's eyes brightened, the first genuine spark of life I'd seen in him since the doorbell rang the night before. He pushed himself up from his chair, a slow and majestic process that always reminded me of a ship launching from dry dock. "Thank you, Fritz, you are a paragon of patience." We moved into the dining room. The table was set with the fine porcelain and heavy silver that Wolfe insisted upon, regardless of whether we were hosting a duchess or just the two of us. For the first 20 minutes, there was no talk of recipes, polymers, or the moral failings of the East Side elite. Wolfe considers talk during the main course to be a form of blasphemy, and I wasn't about to argue with a man who was currently dismantling a goose leg with the precision of a diamond cutter. It wasn't until the salad was cleared and the Stilton was brought out that Wolfe deigned to return to the world of the living. He poured a small glass of port and held it up to the candlelight. "Human folly, Archie," he said, his voice mellowed by the wine. "It is the only truly renewable resource. We spend our lives building fortresses, vaults for our secrets, greenhouses for our flowers, rules for our conduct. And yet we always leave the back door unbolted for our own vanity. Julian's greed, Thorne's resentment, Vance's cold opportunism, they are all variations on a theme. They each believed they could control the chaos they had invited into their lives. And Arthur?" I asked, reaching for a cracker. "Arthur is the most dangerous of all," Wolfe replied, taking a slow sip of the port. "Not because he is clever, but because he is small. A small man with a large desire is a catalyst for catastrophe. He didn't care about the nougat, Archie. He cared that for one day the entire Roth Empire was held together by a piece of paper in his pocket. He was a king of shadows." "Well, the shadows are gone now," I said, looking out the window. The snow had finally started to fall, large, lazy flakes that blanketed 35th Street in a quiet white. "The recipe is in the mail, Saul is on the job, and the brownstone is back to being a fortress. Not a bad Christmas, all things considered." Wolfe grunted, though it was a softer sound than usual. "It was an interruption, Archie, a noisy, untidy, and thoroughly unnecessary interruption. However," he paused, looking toward the hallway that led up to the plant rooms, "I suppose there is a certain satisfaction in reminding the world that even in the dark some of us can still see. I'll drink to that," I said, raising my glass. "To the orchids, the beer, and the fact that I don't have to talk to Julian Roth for at least another year." Wolfe offered a rare, microscopic smile, the kind that most people would miss, but that I'd learned to recognize as a high compliment, a sentiment with which I heartily concur. "Now, Archie, if you are finished with your reflections, I believe there is still a small amount of that chestnut puree left in the kitchen. It would be a tragedy to let it go to waste." I grinned and stood up. The case was closed, the goose was gone, and the world was outside where it belonged. It was just another night at the brownstone, and that was exactly how we liked it.